at the time. All right, so welcome. Good morning. How was your Thanksgiving? Good. All right. Some of you are like, sorry. All right. How many of you it was just mediocre? How many of you hated every minute of it? All right, welcome to those of you at mochurch.tv. Bust out a Bible app or grab a paperback Bibles, pass them down. Turn to Galatians chapter 6. That's page 946 in the house Bibles. So in the book Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, classic book, but Dr. Henry Cloud tells a story in the book about a couple that came to see him. They were parents of a 25-year-old man, and they basically said, man, we need to figure out how to fix our son Joshua. And so he asked, well, where's Joshua at? And they said, well, he didn't want to come because he doesn't feel like he has a problem. And Dr. Cloud responded, well, maybe he's right. Tell me about it. And just the fact that he acknowledged Joshua might not have a problem, the parents were both like, blink, blink. Okay, that was awkward. So they began to tell the story from the time that Joshua was young up until recently, where Joshua had a drug problem. And he had developed a drug problem, and he was having problems staying in college, going to class, things like that, and really having trouble finding a career. So he was kind of a perpetual student at the time. And it was obvious that these parents loved their son very much, this 25-year-old dude named Joshua, but they were heartbroken about the choices that he was making. And so they felt like, man, we've tried everything, but Joshua, he's still using drugs, he's avoiding responsibility, he's hanging out with questionable riffraff, like just weird people. And so they told Dr. Cloud that they had always given him everything he needed. They were covering his finances so that he could try to focus on studying and his social life, and he wouldn't have to work while he was in college. And when he flunked out from not going to class, they helped him find another school that would be a, quote, better fit for Joshua. So after the parents talked for a while, Dr. Cloud, he said, well, I just want to be honest with you. I think your son is right. He doesn't have a problem. And they were like, what? What do you mean he doesn't have a problem? And their eyes pop out of their head, and Dr. Cloud said, yeah, he doesn't have a problem, you do. And they're like, what? And so he said, yeah, your son doesn't have a problem. The things that should be his problem, they aren't. The things that should be his problems are your problems. You've accepted them onto yourself. And so Dr. Cloud said, I think the solution is to clarify some boundaries. Okay, title of the book. He said, I think you need to clarify some boundaries so that his actions cause problems for him and not for you. So otherwise, what he said to this couple is, you guys are interfering with the typical cause and effect way that things work in life. If you sow this, well, you're going to reap this, okay? And you're interfering between the sowing and the reaping, and that's a problem. You're breaking up the cause and effect process. So then Dr. Cloud shared this analogy with him. He said, it's like this. It's like your adult son lives next door to you in a house where the lawn looks awful. It's brown, it's dying, it's nasty. So you have chosen to take your sprinklers and aim them onto his lawn. So after a while, his lawn looks great, but your lawn is brown and dying and nasty. And so you look at your lawn and you get frustrated, and he comes out and he strolls around his lawn saying, look how green and lush my lawn is. And he said, that's your son's life right now. Like, he doesn't study, he doesn't plan, he doesn't work, and he has this nice place to live, plenty of money, and he has all the rights of a family member who's not doing his part. And so basically, this is the harsh reality. Your son is irresponsible, and he's happy. And you are responsible, and you're miserable. Like, that's not healthy. That's not the way it should work. You're the responsible one, but his lawn is green and yours is dying. It's not right. It's not healthy. So he told the parents, you need some boundaries. Not a gate to keep them out of your life or anything like that. You need some boundaries to establish for your adult son so that his problems are his problems. And basically, if you define the property lines between your property and his property, so to speak, then adjust the sprinkler system back to focusing on your own lawn and letting him deal with his lawn, you let him live in dirt for a while and see if he likes it after a while. See what happens. So otherwise, basically to sum this up, is what he's saying is sometimes helping actually isn't helping. Sometimes helping doesn't help, right? And that can be really confusing sometimes to figure out, when should I help and when is helping not helping the situation? So according to the book, this is kind of my paraphrase definition of what the book says, but boundaries are taking responsibility for your own actions and emotions. We have a slide for this, while not taking responsibility for the actions or emotions of others. Okay? It's saying, all right, I'm going to take responsibility for my own actions and emotions, but as for yours, I'm not going to take responsibility for yours. So a boundary is determining what is me and what are mine, what are my things to deal with, but also what defines you and what defines your responsibility. So you have to figure that out, because I have to have my boundaries defined around me, and I take care of that. And creating these boundaries is a life skill. It is a life skill for healthy relationships and for you to be healthy spiritually and emotionally. And the only way that you can have peace, because I know we've got some people in our lives here and there, maybe not all of them, but there's a few people or one person in your life. The only way for you to have peace about your relationship with this person is to define boundaries and to say, here's a boundary. This is me, that's you. And the only way I can have peace is if I've created this boundary. So how do you know when to help? How do you know when to help somebody and when not to help somebody? And so the purpose today really is, hopefully we'll learn some lessons that will keep us from accumulating future baggage, because some of us already have some relational baggage from relationships like this. Some people that you can't just break up with, some people that you have these relationships with that you can't just choose to break up with because you saw them at Thanksgiving. You're going to see them at Christmas maybe. You know how it is. It's maybe a sibling or something like that. And so this baggage has accumulated, and maybe this will keep you from accumulating more baggage in the future, to say, how do I know when to help and when not to help? And this book, it was written a number of years ago, called Boundaries, but it's a great resource. If you go to a grad level psychology degree, they're going to assign this book or refer to it. It's that pioneering on this topic. So maybe the best thing for you is just go on Amazon, order this book, and start reading it. I recommended a book 2 weeks ago. I'm sure you're done with that by now, so you can pick up Boundaries, just get to chipping away at that. So, but for now, if you look at Galatians chapter 6, page 946, I want to give you a couple of godly principles by a guy named Paul, St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was a first century skeptic turned Christian. And he wrote this letter called Galatians, and it's basically to some Christians who were clearly struggling in relationships with one another. At one point he tells them, stop biting and devouring each other. Like they're struggling relationally. And so in verse 2, Paul tells these Christians this: carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Now, the law of Christ is basically what Jesus said to his disciples: you guys are to love one another. The way that people are going to know you're my disciples is if you love one another. That's the law of Christ. So it's generally love people, but this is a more important, like next level subpoint. Not more important, but a next level subpoint. The law of Christ is specifically, you are to love other followers of Jesus, brothers and sisters in Christ. There's some extra responsibility to the spiritual family. So fulfill the law of Christ. Carry each other's burdens. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, this really doesn't fully apply to you, or it's optional if you want to pitch in and be like, I want to help a brother or sister in Christ, someone from the church, but I'm not a follower of Jesus yet. That's optional. But if you're a follower of Jesus, this is an assignment. You are my disciple, and I want you to fulfill the law of Christ. So Jesus taught it. Paul is passing it on again, saying fulfill the law of Christ. And so love one another. At times, to do that, we carry each other's burdens. Now, a burden is anything of excess, okay? It's anything that's too big for one person to carry alone. That is what a burden is. So a burden, anything too big for one person to carry alone. So we, as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, have this responsibility to help bear a burden that's become too big for one person to bear alone. So Paul says, hey, okay, while you're bearing one another's burdens, carrying one another's burdens, here's this. Let me share a posture, an attitude that you should have while you do that. And in verse 3 he says, if anyone thinks there's something when they are not, they deceive themselves. You ever met somebody who thinks there's something and they're not?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever been tempted to think you're something and you're not? Because we're all tempted to do that at some time, even loud front row right here. If anyone thinks, I got a fist bump for you. Come give me a fist bump. All right, so if anyone thinks there's something when they're not, they deceive themselves. And what he's saying here is he's kind of trying to say, hey, don't trick yourself into thinking that you're somebody special. All right, because the posture that you want to have if you're helping someone carry a burden is not, I'm above you. Okay? I'm so above you. Like, what is your problem that you have this burden, this thing going on here? What is your major malfunction? Because you can be tempted to think you're something when you're not, right? Like, you can be tempted to be like, wait, what? That happened to you and you didn't have insurance? Wait a minute, what? You're single and you got pregnant? Wait a minute, what? You got behind the wheel of a car? Like, that's what he's saying. Don't think you're something when you're not. Like, basically he's saying, hey, you're not immune to the very kind of burden that you may be helping somebody else out with. You're not immune to that. So don't think you're something when you're not. And he slaps the smugness right off our face in that verse. Then he introduces the idea of personal responsibility in verse 4. And he says this, each one should test their own actions. So personal responsibility. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. Now, this isn't the sinful kind of pride. This is the good pride. The kind of pride you get from a job well done. Like, man, I finished that task. I completed a project. I finished my homework. I did that thing. Like, that's a good pride. You should feel that thing because that's a positive thing. You should feel good about it. And don't compare yourselves to one another. Don't be like, wait, what? Your burden? What? Well, I would never. Don't do that. Just don't get into the comparison game. Then Paul says something that's a little bit mind-boggling at first, and it might come across as a contradiction at first. Then he goes on to say, for each one should carry their own load. Wait a minute. 3 verses ago, Paul, have you already forgotten? You said, carry each other's burdens, right? Now, 3 verses later, you're saying, for each one should carry their own load. But this isn't a contradictory statement by Paul. In fact, he's using 2 completely different words in the English and in the original language, which was Greek, 2 completely different words. So the first word we already talked about is burden. Okay, so the Greek word for burden, like I said, it means anything that's too big for one person to carry. Burdens are excess burdens. They're things that are so heavy that they weigh us down. So a burden's anything too big for one person to carry alone. Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend, they put it like this. A burden is like a boulder, okay? A boulder is something that it weighs you down. Like no one person can or should carry a boulder. It crushes you. And that's a burden that's too big for one person to carry. And it's something you were not meant to carry alone or to lift yourself. You need help carrying boulders, okay? But then the second word is then load, your own load. So Paul says each one should carry their own load. So the second Greek word here means cargo or a soldier's pack. So your own load is basically, it's like your own backpack, all right? It's your own backpack. This is your own stuff. This is the cargo of one person, all right? A backpack isn't made for 3. Backpack isn't made for 10. It's made for one person. It goes on your back. This is your responsibility. It's your own cargo load, your own soldier's pack. Even Dora can handle this, all right? Even Ash from Pokemon can handle this, all right? So this is something just for you. So the backpack load or the cargo load, that's whatever you've been given to carry. This is whatever you've been given to handle yourself. For example, a cargo load would be your feelings, right? Like nobody's responsible for your feelings. You have to be responsible for your feelings. Another example would be your attitude. No one can change your attitude except for you, right? Now, some of you right now are already like, this sounds like the talk I have with my children. It is, okay? No one can change your attitude. You are responsible. I am responsible for my own attitude. Your behaviors. No one can change your behaviors. You are responsible for your actions, no matter what the climate, the situation. You are the one making the choice. No one can choose for you to do what's good, what's right, what's godly, what's healthy. No one but you can choose that. And your responsibilities. That's in your backpack too. Your responsibilities. These are the things that have been handed to you that you are supposed to handle as your responsibility. So, doing your own homework, paying your rent, mowing or watering your own lawn, cleaning the snow from your driveway, providing food and shelter for your children, being a father if you're a father, being a mother if you're a mother. In non-crisis situations, those are things in your backpack. That's your cargo load. Those are your regular responsibilities. So we're expected to deal with, I'm expected to deal with my own feelings, behaviors, attitude, mortgage, electricity bill, that kind of stuff, grocery bill, whatever. And no one should ask you to carry their backpack for them, right? That would be unfair because that's their personal cargo load. That's the regular responsibilities that God has given to them and can be carried by one person. So there are backpacks, but there are also boulders, okay? So boulders, to explain a little bit more, are those burdens. They're heavy burdens, too big for one person to bear. So like a crisis or a tragedy happens. That is like a boulder is dropped on someone's back. Like life happens and a crisis pops up. So a burden is when somebody gets sick, right? Maybe there's a family or it's a single person. Somebody gets sick. Maybe they even end up in a hospital. That is a burden, all right? And so people might help carry that burden. Someone loses their job. That is a burden, okay? That is a huge weight just dropped on their back. Someone leaves, like a spouse just up and left. That becomes this burden, this weight, this boulder that person shouldn't have to carry alone through that transition. Someone's house gets flooded, or there's a house fire. Last year at about this time, right before Halloween, Momentum's Rob and Michelle Stiles had a house fire, and they lost so much stuff. That is a burden. That is a boulder. That's not a backpack thing. And it was great to see the family of Momentum kind of rally around them to carry that burden. But when it comes to a burden or a boulder, you don't have the strength, the resources, sometimes the knowledge to carry this boulder or this burden by yourself. And God didn't mean for you to carry that boulder by yourself. And I would add, even though it's a positive thing, sometimes there are beautiful blessing things that happen that at first feel like an overwhelming, non-negative burden. Somebody adopts a child. They bring a child into their home. It doesn't matter how prepared, how many dozens of hours of classes they went through to prepare for this thing, because they have to. When that child enters the home, it is just this shock to the system, and it is this beginning of like, whoa, we are carrying way more weight than we have ever carried before. Or when someone has the blessing of a brand new child, especially the first child, okay? Can I get an amen? That first child is like, oh my God, Dan, are you saying that babies are burdens? Well, you are right now, just by asking that question, okay? Babies are not burdens, but they are overwhelming because it takes a village, right? It takes a village. Like, that's why in most situations, there's a mom that shows up to help, the new mom with a grandma shows up to help new mom figure things out because you're like, the baby's always crying. Is it wet? Is it dying? Is it hungry? What is wrong? You don't know. You're freaking out. And that is this thing. It's just like, oh, this weight. I have no idea. I don't have the knowledge to carry this boulder by myself. So typically at Momentum, what happens is these burdens are shared by Mo groups. Okay, so when someone's in a Mo group and a boulder is dropped on them, we're like, okay, this is an awful thing, but here's the deal. they have a spiritual family to kind of wrap around them, to rally to that person. And let's say there's a group of 6 to 12 or 10 to 20 sometimes, that someone has a crisis, a boulder's dropped on them. There's no way they can carry that boulder. So people in the Mo group, those who can, because some might be in the middle of something themselves at that moment, you know? But most people are just carrying their own backpacks, and they might say, okay, I have enough energy to chip in and help carry this burden with them for a short time. I can show up, I can rally to them, I can help them with a meal, I can do whatever it takes. I can offer to say, do you need your children picked up after school? They might say no because you're creepy, okay? But they might say yes. You know, they might say, can I provide dinner? Can I show up and mow the lawn for a temporary time? Can I show up and clear snow for a temporary time? They might take up an offering for you. Whatever it is, they will rally to you to say, I want to help carry that burden. And some of us in this group right now can. Some of us have the capacity to help. Here's the deal. If you're not in a Mo group, though, the system kind of breaks down, okay? Because, one, it's much harder for us to know about your burden. You might think no one cares. The truth is usually no one knows. Okay, so one, it's harder for us to know about your burden. Two, it's hard for us to help carry your burden then. We're not around you. We only see you on Sunday morning or crossing paths out in the community. And so it's really hard for us to help carry your burden. Now, in a typical church, you know, way back in history now, up to recent years, a few decades ago, the typical system was in any church that the pastor's family helped carry any boulder that was dropped on a group of people. So if there were 300 people in that church, a boulder would be dropped on one of those people. They have a crisis, and the pastor would show up and he'd help with that boulder. Or, oftentimes in my family, the pastor's wife will show up. My wife is very loving, very giving. She will provide meals. She will do whatever she can to make sure you're supported. But she'd show up and hold that up. And so what happens is the more boulders that happen, there might be several people in a church that experience crises around the same time, that eventually that gets overwhelming for a pastor's family. And so typically what they've seen over the last several decades is it's hard for one pastor to care for a church that's much bigger than 50 people. They might, if they're a superstar, make it to 100 people that they can care for as crises pop up throughout the church. But eventually they're going to burn out and be overwhelmed by it. So what healthy churches have seen and leaders and elders over the years is like, hey, but if there are smaller groups of people, that their responsibility is for one another ministry, and they have a leader that's a shepherd of 10, then when a crisis pops up in that group, there might be 10 people to rally to them, not just one pastor showing up at the hospital. There might be 10 people rallying to them, helping out, and usually there's not always, but usually there's not a rapid fire of crises in a group of 10 to 20 where, man, we are just all so overwhelmed. That is really rare. So that's why it's so important, one of the many reasons for you to be in a Mo group so that you can help carry other people's burdens when they pop up. And the same thing can happen for you when they pop up in your life. When our oldest son, Zion, was in preschool, we put him in the Bedford Co-op, all right, for preschool. And he had two leaders. He was under the instruction of two teachers. One was Miss Brenda, and the kids all affectionately called her Miss Frenda, all right? The other one was a lady named Mrs. H. And eventually in 2007, after my wife Shannon worked in the preschool volunteering for that day, helped out, she got curious, Mrs. H did, about Momentum and started going online to watch some of our funny videos. Eventually she watched a testimony, a spiritual story video by a lady that used to be a part of Momentum named Angie Campbell, who I love dearly. And she heard her story and she was like, you know what, I'm going to show up and check out this movie church, she called it. And so she started coming to the movie church in 2007. And some of you may know Mrs. H. She goes nowadays by Georgette Hillenbrand, okay? So Georgette, she showed up and she's got a wicked swing, all right? And so, man, she will hit a line drive right at your eyes, all right? And so now the first 2 years she was a part of Momentum, we still called her Mrs. H. Me and my wife did, like, oh, hi, Mrs. H, so good to see you. Because it's like when you see a teacher of your own out in public. Have you ever ran into one of your teachers at the grocery store and you're like, oh, hi, Mrs. Collier, you know, you're like that or whatever. And then someone else, like an adult person, comes by and they're like, oh, hi, Maria. And you're like, oh, she's a Maria. I didn't know she's a Maria. I didn't know she looked like a Maria. Oh, wow, that's crazy. She reminds me of the West Side Story. She grew up in Spanish Harlem, living her life just like a movie star. Maria. Anybody with me? All right. Too many pasty skins in this room to know that reference. All right. So Mrs. H was like, stop calling me Mrs. H. I'm Georgette. Like, okay, we got to relearn that. Georgette. All right. So Georgette had been raised in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and she hadn't been to church in decades. And so, I mean, you know, she was only 27, but she hadn't been in decades. So Georgette, she eventually hosted a Mo group at her house. And eventually Georgette at Momentum decided to follow Jesus and was baptized. And she says, and I've heard her say this on multiple occasions, she said, you know what, when I showed up at Momentum, I was happy. Like I felt like I had everything I needed. I was, you know, married to my husband, Ken, and we have 2 adult daughters who she loves dearly. And, you know, just like my life was pretty sweet. I didn't feel like it was something that I was really missing. Yeah, I was pretty darn happy. But in 2011, her husband, Ken, passed away. And that became this boulder dropped on her shoulders. Now, Georgette, she is an extremely strong woman. But dealing with the excruciating pain of losing her husband, her friend, her companion of 37 years. And she had to grasp for the first time, like, man, I'm doing life from now forward without my Ken. Like, what does that look like? And she said, and I just think this is beautiful, she was like, you know what? When I showed up at Momentum, I didn't feel like there was anything I needed. I was so happy. My life felt really kind of full and complete in a lot of ways. She said, but I feel like God nudged me and led me to the family of Momentum because he knew what was coming up the pike eventually, and I was going to need people to rally around me when I lost my dear husband. And she's like, I get it. And she told me recently, like, here's the thing I know about God. He knows what I need, and he loves me. And she's like, God in advance, I believe, prepared me to enter into this family so that they could rally around me and help me shoulder this burden, carry this boulder that I could not carry alone. Remember what David read earlier, Psalm 68. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. Isn't that a beautiful picture? He sets the lonely in families. Otherwise, God sets the lonely in families, and then we read from Paul that God tells those families, carry each other's burdens. Like I've set them in the spiritual family, and now carry burdens with one another when they pop up. Now, I hope this message really ultimately becomes kind of a filter for Mo groups, Mo group leaders and apprentices and hosts when you get in dilemmas and things like that. This can become really a good filter for anyone who has a need that might pop up in your Mo group. And you're welcome to be merciful as a person anytime you want to someone. If you're like, man, I want to help them move. Man, that's awesome. I want to provide a meal for them when they have a baby, anything like that. But sometimes it might be helpful to ask in a situation, are we offering to help them with a burden, or are we offering to help them with their backpack? Like, I don't know if we should help right now. We want to be generous, but every once in a while it's good to ask the question, are we helping them with a burden, or are we offering to carry their backpack? Because everyone else in this group has their own backpack to carry already, right? And so sometimes that will be a helpful filter. But when boulders are dropped on people, we rally to them. We are their spiritual family, the family of Momentum, and that Mo group specifically rallies to them. And this all comes from the gospel, meaning the good news of Jesus, the story of Jesus. Like the reason that we're sacrificial and sacrificially love others, the reason we lay down our lives at times for other people is because that's what Christ did for us. When we couldn't do it ourselves, Jesus saved us in a sacrificial way. And so we say, man, we learned this from Jesus. We learned this from the gospel. That's why we do this for one another, and he taught us to. Now, there are 2 things. I want to wrap up with 2 things that Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend say are problems with these 2 different types of weights, okay? The backpacks and the burdens. What are 2 problems that can pop up? Well, the first one is when people act as if their backpacks are boulders, okay? So when this happens, the result is irresponsibility, right? That's Joshua in the opening story. When we act like our backpacks are actually boulders and we want people to help us carry them, that's not good, that's not healthy, those aren't good boundaries. So if I want you to carry my backpack, the problem with that is I never get a chance to experience the pride that comes from me finishing my own homework. You know, the experience of me paying my own rent, the experience of me covering my own gas. We're talking about adults here, right? And so to do that, I don't ever get to feel that good pride, that positive feeling that's a good thing. And so when you don't carry your own backpack, here's what happens. You get evicted. You get the electric turned off and Xbox doesn't work anymore, okay? When you don't carry your own backpack, that's the way things go down. In fact, listen to what Paul says. Paul says this, same guy who's compassionate, carry one another's burdens. But he says this, keep away from every believer who's idle. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. It's cause and effect. Like we're not carrying each other's backpacks. We're carrying each other's burdens. Everyone needs to be responsible, a responsible human being. So if they don't work, they don't eat. Let them experience that. They need to. That's healthy. And so a really important word for you to learn in establishing boundaries, the main basic important word is no. No. I can't do that for you. Or I could, but I won't. And the most essential word is no, especially when it comes to someone who continually wants to borrow money. Especially when it comes to someone who wants to live in your house. Okay? Now, I know there are extenuating circumstances that say, okay, yes, this is a single parent, or there's sickness or an illness, or something's happened, that it makes total sense that you say, I want to be generous, I want to be hospitable and help them out. But a remedy for someone just not carrying their backpack is to establish boundaries. Here's where I am and where I end. Here's where you are and where you begin and end. And I say, no. I'm not going to help you carry that back. For some of you in your temperament, that's really difficult to do, right? You're so sweet. You're so caring. It's hard to say no to anything. And so you're going to have to say, I draw a line here. That's your backpack to carry. If you don't carry that cargo load yourself, I hate this for you. But you're going to experience the consequences of not carrying your own backpack. So when we feel responsible to carry one another's backpacks, we rob them of experiencing the outcomes of their decisions. And this is actually harmful to other people, to rob them of experiencing the outcome, because they never learn that good pride. They never learn responsibility for their own thoughts, emotions, feelings, and actions, and things that they need to take care of. So as much as you are a sweet person, as much as you love your adult child, don't interfere with the cause and effect process of sowing and reaping, or you are actually harming them. Because the problem becomes that they are irresponsible and happy, and you are being responsible and miserable, right? And so you're actually harming them outside of extenuating circumstances. In fact, what you're doing, you're not helping them. In psychology, what that's called is what? Enabling them. And that is very harmful to them and to you. And then problem number 2 is, and I'll finish with this. Problem number 2 is when people act as if their boulders are just backpacks, okay? They're carrying baggage from the past, or a boulder was dropped on them right now, and they act as if their boulders are really just backpacks, and they refuse help from anyone. They're like, no, I don't need help, I'm good with this. And the end of that, if the end of the first one is irresponsibility, the end of this one is perpetual pain. And God doesn't want that for you, because people are not meant to carry boulders by themselves. And we've got people here who have some major baggage from the past. Some stuff that they're even just trying to carry by themselves that they've carried since childhood even, you know, like they grew up with a parent who was addicted, which is the story of that song that we performed by NF, who had a mom addicted to drugs and eventually accidentally took her own life with an overdose. And some of you grew up in situations like that, or a home where a parent struggled, God forbid, with mental illness, but that had repercussions on the way that you were brought up. Or maybe you were in an abusive home or an abusive relationship. And here's the complication, as I said a couple weeks ago, God made you for relationships. He created you to love God, to love him, and to love people. And so here's where it gets really messy and difficult, is our brains are wired for connection by God, but trauma rewires them for protection. And that's why healthy relationships are really difficult for people who have been wounded. Okay, so as soon as you're wounded and you're like, man, I know God made me for relationships. I hear you, Dan, but what I went through, it makes me want to protect myself. It makes me want to not trust people because of what this person did, what this person said about me, what this person did when they abandoned me, whatever it was. And I just want to say, one, as a pastor, I want to say as your pastor, I'm so sorry that this happened to you, because that is not what God intended to happen in relationships. And God weeps with you over that. And some of you have been hurt by people who just didn't have any boundaries, and they continually hurt themselves. And there was this effect where others, collateral damage, were hurt unintentionally around them. And so I just want to say, God weeps with you. And I'm so sorry that happened. Psalm 68, remember, we keep going back to this. God sets the lonely in families, though. Okay? So his hope is to say, but I've placed you in a family, this family of Momentum. And God has placed you in this family called Momentum so that through these relationships, through maybe just one or two, that you could begin the process of healing. And so can I say it any clearer? Make time for a Mo group, okay? Because this is the deal. You need community, especially if you've been through trauma or you've been hurt. You need community, and you need to learn to build trust. But here's the good news. You get to pick who you trust. If you go to a Mo group, there are going to be some people there who might not be safe. They're entering in also broken, wounded, hurting, with baggage. And you get to say, I think that person's a safe person. I think that person's a safe person. And you get to build trust and trust them more. And you get to pick whoever you want. You get to say, that's the safe person that I'm going to begin being vulnerable to about what I'm coming out of. But the opposite of that is true, is that fear, anxiety, and isolation will defeat you, because God has made you for relationships, and you cannot carry a boulder by yourself. You cannot act like a boulder is just a backpack, or you will be crushed in life in a way that God does not want you to be crushed. So let me just say this. God has placed you here. He set you in a family for a purpose. He's given you spiritual family to say, I've provided these people around you, and sprinkled throughout this crowd and sprinkled in a Mo group are people who are safe people that you can begin to build trust with. I don't want you to have perpetual pain. I want you to have people in your life that you can trust. And when that happens, then you might also be able to, in the future, help carry someone else's burden and to carry their boulder, because you're carrying your backpack and you're able to pitch in for others also. Backpacks and